only we had an Old Testament scholar to talk about the end times with us.
Don't tempt me. I went through a point in my I don't have my microphone set up though, but I did go through a point in my faith walk where I got really obsessed with Revelation. Really obsessed.
Cool.
Yeah,
Did you read all
Cool.
47 books of Left Behind?
I did.
What? I only
What
made
I'm
my
talking
way through
about.
like 19 of the young version.
Oh, my
Because
mom
of,
tried to buy those for my kids at a used bookstore last
oh
summer,
my
and I
gosh.
rebuked her.
Because of dyslexia, I didn't read a book on my own until first year of high school. And the first books I read on my own were the entire Left Behind series
Oh my god.
and and the book series, the young adult series called Rainbow Boys.
What is
Oh,
the
At the
Rainbow
same
Boys
time.
about?
It's this love triangle between these four gay guys, or three gay guys in high
Wait,
school.
I think I've seen this at a Goodwill once, and I was like,
Yeah,
what
probably.
is this?
that totally cancels out reading Left Behind. I like it. You ended up
What?
back at like a zero sum for that.
I read them at the exact same time.
I think they cancel each other out.
Yeah. Technically, you didn't read anything, Josh.
Yeah, I think you're at
Nothing.
zero now.
Yep, that's it.
Oh, that's
All
awesome.
right.
All right. He does actually have dyslexia. Josh, Nora just heard you talking about dyslexia, and she's about as dyslexic as a human being can be. And she went, oh, dyslexia? Did he say dyslexia? So now you're like
Yes,
zero.
dyslexic friends.
He's a nerd and loves to read and is dyslexic.
We love it. We love to see it.
He finally found a book this summer. All right. Hey, what's up, Grant?
Hello. It's good to talk with you. I feel like we haven't talked in a while.
I know. I've heard you several times on podcasts and talks and other things in the last couple of months, but I don't even think, did I see you in person at Revoice?
I think we maybe saw each other briefly, and I said, "Oh, hey, I think I like asked you about what you're doing. You're like, I'm not supposed to be here,
I'm
actually."
not, yeah. And see, it
And
was so
then,
impactful. I don't even remember actually talking to you. So yeah, I was trying really
yeah,
hard to not be there.
yeah,
Yeah,
but you
finishing
were
up
there.
sabbatical while at Revoice was an oxymoron. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
It was
So
good
good to
stuff. Well,
see
yeah,
you.
it's good to see you and to talk. Well, we have been spending the last four episodes, or this will be the fourth episode, in this theological dive into kind of the grand narrative of Scripture. That's what we called it when I used to teach Bible, of creation, fall, or the big breakup. That's what redemption and restoration or glorification or getting things back to the way God intended for eternity, however you want to describe that. So this is going to be the last episode where we get to talk about all things theoretical. What's it going to look like in glorification? So
Uh,
have you listened to the first three? I know you participated. So have you listened to the rest of
I
them?
I participated in the first one on creation, but I have
And it
not
was
listened to the other ones yet.
okay.
Um, so this is going to be. I hope what we say builds on what has come before, but
Oh, absolutely.
eh,
It's amazing. Yeah, the one that I did talking about sin. I totally recorded it before I listened to y'all's, and then went back and listened, and was so thankful that the Holy Spirit guides because they lined up really well. And I was like, I need to make sure that I listen to these before I do the next one because I mean, it's great to rely on the Holy Spirit. That's a really important thing, but it's
absolutely.
also nice to know what you're building on. So yeah,
Yeah, the Holy
that's
Spirit
good.
uses our knowledge too, and what we've learned. So
We have to
the
give
Holy,
him
give
tools
the
to
Holy
work
Spirit
with,
something to
right?
work with.
That's right. That's right. I like that. Well, what how did you feel coming off that creation conversation? I because it was interesting listening to y'all having worked with it for years now with all of us that there were a couple of times that it sounded like y'all weren't terribly sure if you were really going to talk about what you absolutely fully believe. Like you were nervous to say, hey, this is what I really believe about stuff. But then it ended up being this like fascinating conversation. And how did you feel in that first conversation about creation?
Yeah, I think something that's interesting about this sort of theological mini series is that we're all coming to it from slightly and maybe even very different theological traditions. And
Yeah.
so we're offering our thoughts and we don't necessarily agree on everything. So I think I was wondering about how that was going to go down, but I think it turned out really well. And it, I think we had discussed this in the group message, but we were nervous about getting into theological conversations because we were afraid we were going to get out of our depth. And I'm sure there's plenty of stuff that's out of my depth, but it was fun. It was fun that we had a lot of kind of formed thoughts on in the creation episode, and it ended up being really fun. So I suspect it will be similar with this conversation. But how were the other two episodes?
Oh, they were absolutely fantastic. Listening to Henry and Elizabeth for that last one, that I did say in the group chat that I ugly cried while I was mowing the grass listening to it. That they also talked about at one point wanting to, or Elizabeth starting a church, and I was like, if we just had like a kaleidoscope non-denominational church somewhere and Henry and Elizabeth were running it, I think that I would move to help with that church plant,
I would
because
love
they
to be a part of
had
that.
church on that episode and it was so healing and so helpful.
Oh,
And
that's so
I
good.
hope other people thought it was as great as I thought it was, because I've already listened to it like 3 times.
Oh,
It was
nice.
just very, very timely and very needed. Oh, 4 times. My daughter says 4 times as I'm being interrupted by a 10-year-old to let me know how many times I've listened to it. Yeah, it was good stuff. So
Good.
I enjoyed getting to talk about sin, which is kind of a weird
Yeah.
thing to say, but we don't ever get to have conversations like that about, so what does that look like? And so it was
Yeah.
really enjoyed getting to have that talk.
And I think what I love this whole reclaiming series, this theme for this season, because we get to talk about things that have been wielded against us in really painful
Right.
ways, and we get to engage with it in a way that's actually safe. So talking about sin, like, ooh, that sounds scary. If it were if it weren't us, if it weren't us, that seems really scary. It could be really scary, but it's nice to be able to engage with that topic freely and safely, and humbly, and knowing that like there's plenty of
Right.
sin in my life. I'm a sinner for sure. But
Yeah.
it's nice to not have to feel like super pressured by that kind of conversation. So
Oh
that's really
yeah.
cool.
And that's what I think is going to be so great about this last topic. Looking at glorification is sort of like the end arrival of, we've gone through all of this stuff, we've discussed it, we've looked at sin, we've looked at how we live in this life. We had a good conversation about what justification means. So we've got the next kind of theological term with glorification. What do you think of when you hear somebody talking about glorification?
Um, I think, well, I do think about my very first controversy back in the day.
Yes. Love it.
Um, Thinking about, there's that passage in the book of Revelation that talks about the kings of the earth bringing the honor and glory of the nations into the New Jerusalem. And the idea for me is that this new future city is going to have everything in it that is good and beautiful and true. And so it really excites me to think about what that could look like. It's of course super speculative, and I can't say anything for certain, but yeah, I think that's the thing that comes to mind most quickly for me. But what about you?
Yeah, the whole glorification aspect of theology and looking at that is something that I really avoided for a long time because it fell into that idea of end times.
Hmm.
And I didn't like, I grew up Southern Baptist, and so it was very pre-tribulation. Jesus is coming and he's going to take all the Christians out, and then the world is going to be this horrible, horrible place, and then he's going to come back and reign in Jerusalem, and then like that was it. It was like, okay, so what's it going to be past that? And there was never any discussion of what does eternity look like. It was always just Jesus is going to come back and reign. And so there was no what does that look like? And so you had to rely on like Looney Tunes images of, like floating on clouds with harps, and
Yeah.
everything's going to be perfect. There's going to be no more sin. And it seemed like that was equated with that American Puritanism of being boring. And I was
Oh
like,
yeah.
that sounds so we're just going to work
It's
and
just
not
gonna be
fight
church
for
forever.
all of eternity. And that sounded awful. So like I never studied it because I was like, that sounds terrible. Like, why would you want to live like
Yeah.
that? But the last few years of realizing that what you think about eschatology, our big theological term, the end times, actually affects how you live now. Like what you believe about the end of this chronological world that we live in and being ushered into eternity affects how you live now. Like if you believe in a pre-millennial, pre-tribulation rapture, God is just going to burn the thing down and start over, then creation care, even though it's mandated in Genesis, doesn't really seem that important because God's just going to burn it all down anyway. So it affects so much of how you live.
Yeah.
But I have just been fascinated the last few years thinking about the idea of holiness and like how that works with glorification, like holiness and glory. That it's that idea of perfection, more that you see it in scripture as perfect being complete, not that it's boring or that puritanical idea, but just that something is complete. It has reached its fullness and it is what God intended it to be. And that can be so full of fun and joy and like sticking with that idea of holiness and glory, that the most holy, glorified, sinless being who ever walked the earth was Jesus. And he turned water into wine at a wedding and
That's
got in
right.
trouble, right? Got
Yes,
in
he did.
trouble going to dinner parties with prostitutes and tax collectors. Like, if you're looking for the definition of holy and then you see how Jesus lived his life and you think this is what it's going to be like for eternity, he worked hard and he played hard. I like that idea. Like
Yeah.
that sounds much, much better. And
Yeah.
so building off of what Jesus had to say about the end times as opposed to what like Tim LaHaye has to say about the end times, God bless the Left Behind series, right? Um, it seems like a fantastic way to spend eternity of
Yeah.
a glorified work hard, play hard. There's nothing that gets in the way of perfected community. But we're not going to be like sitting around on clouds with harps. Like we're
Yeah.
going to be doing life. We're just going to be doing it in a way that we're not hurting each other anymore. And that
Yeah.
sounds amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like sign me up for that, you know?
Absolutely. I think another thought that I've had along those similar lines is I don't think that a glorified, resurrected life is going to be static.
Yeah.
Like, so the idea of completeness or wholeness isn't going to mean that we're not going to like always be learning more or doing more. I think the resurrected life is kind of ever expanding. I think of a C.S. Lewis. I took a C.S. Lewis class in college, and it's sort of rewired my brain. But we read The Last Battle,
Yes.
and that was one of the books where I cried. Okay, it was Voyage of the Dawn Treader with
Yes.
Reepicheep with Reepicheep. Oh, I cried. And then Last Battle, I cried.
Oh yeah.
But there was that scene where they're all in New Narnia, and they're all sort of moving forward and galloping off into further up and further into more and
Yeah.
more of New Narnia. And they just keep going forever. They just keep going and exploring more, and there's always more to
Yeah.
explore. One of my favorite thinkers, at least over the past couple years, has been Gregory of Nyssa, early church father, and he contrasted, or his vision of this of the resurrected life contrasted with that of Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine thought it's going to be like a Sabbath, like eternal rest, and Gregory of Nyssa said, "You're never going to be satisfied. You're going to keep wanting more. It's going to go on forever.
Yeah.
You're gonna keep learning more about God because God is infinite. You're gonna keep growing. It's gonna be infinite. It's just gonna keep going on forever and ever and ever." And that seems really exciting to me. So it's not a stasis, but it moves on for eternity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's ever new. That's really exciting for me.
Yeah. The first time I really considered what eternity is actually going to be like was when I was in seminary working on my MDiv, and we listened to a guy present part of his PhD dissertation work, and he was focusing specifically on the environment and eternity. And his thesis was that when John talks about things being destroyed in fire and the new heavens and the new earth and all of these things, that if we were created before the fall to live on the earth, and you take that image and picture of like a refiner's fire and how the Lord burns the things off that are not for his glory and for our good, that he viewed that fire like a refining fire, and that for the new heavens and the new earth, that the things that were made and created and developed by humans in time would survive that, so that it would just be building upon the creation and the culture that humanity has already built, and the things that we built for his glory are left, and then we continue to build on those things. So like when Jeremiah talks about living your life for the good of the city, that things that we were mandated to create culture, like God's not going to just cancel out all the work that all of humanity has done, because like he sent us to do a job, and he's not going to just like destroy that work, you know. And so like just speculating like that kind of got my imagination going a little bit, thinking about we're going to have all of eternity to see the amazing things on the planet that
Yeah.
people created because God just made us to create.
Yeah.
And that, just that idea and that thought of being able to see and to enjoy the culture that we've already built, and then to continue building on that in this glorified way, I mean, that's just, it's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
I love to think about the way that is going to be, because right now there are so many limitations on things, and
For
and
sure.
it's so frustrating to think about things, because I have such a wanderlust anyway. So just on a really
Yeah.
like physical, practical level, I'm never going to be able to read all the books. I'm
Ugh,
never going to
I was
be able
just
to
about to
see
say
all the
that.
things, right?
Yes.
I'm
Yes.
never going to be able to see all the things. And it was that reminder of the fact that like God created us for eternity, and we're going to be creating for eternity and having conversations. Like we will be able to have deep theological conversation centered dinner parties for all of eternity. And so those of us who have spent our lived lives feeling a little awkward about the fact that we don't do small talk, but we can spend 6 hours talking about four views on the millennium, you know?
Yeah.
Like that's what we're going to be doing. It's like we were totally created for eternity. And that sounds great to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that idea.
That seems very good, I have to
Yeah.
say. And it's also exciting to think that, like, I love to talk about the theological works of great thinkers throughout history. And it'd be so amazing to have like a dinner party where we're discussing a book and then be like, okay, so, and now we're going to have the author come in and speak to us.
I used to joke that I wanted my house to be between Martin Luther and Spurgeon so that Martin could bring the beer and Charles could bring the cigars and we're all just going to meet at my house and have great conversations. Like that sounds like so much fun.
Yeah, I'd like to have a conversation with Martin Luther too.
They might be a little different now than when I first thought that was going to be a great idea.
That would be fun. I agree.
It'd be fun for different reasons, I bet.
Yeah.
That is that is something I've wondered about. I know that there have been lots of like shifts in views over the last few years, like from when we first met, going from Reformed theology to Catholicism is a big jump.
Yeah.
How has that affected your view of glorification?
Well, I think one of the things, part of the process for me over the past couple years, there's this Reformed truism that grace restores nature.
Yeah.
And that is definitely true to a certain extent. I still hold to a lot of that. But I think at the time I was wondering how to reconcile that view with the idea in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus talks about marriage passing away.
Yeah.
And in the resurrection, we're not going to be married. People won't get married. So it seems like marriage and sexual activity pass away or are transcended. And now I'm pretty convinced of that now. So I'm trying to figure out how to speak about glorification in a way that nature is not just restored to like a garden kind of experience, but it's made into something better. It's transcended. Like our garden nature is transcended and it becomes something even more beautiful. Like we start in a garden, we're in a city by the end. So there is some kind of trajectory. So that was, I think, part of the process for me. But I don't think that's necessarily reducible to like a move from Reformed theology to Catholic theology. I think lots of Reformed folks can get behind that as well. But that was part of the process for me.
I like it. Hey, I'm going to hold on 1 minute. We're going to have to edit this out. There's somebody at my door. Hold on.
Oh, fun. Put this in the bloopers.
You're doing great.
Am I? Are we?
Yes. It's funny you brought up Last Battle literally as I was thinking about it.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's a good one.
It's so good.
Yeah.
I know. My controversial take on glorification. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
That not everything will be resolved.
Okay.
Like,
what do you mean?
I don't believe all human conflict is just going to naturally fall away.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, because we're
feel
still
like
going to be limited.
We're still going to have a like sit down counseling session with God where he sits us down with Rosaria Butterfield.
Like we're going to spend like the first 15 years of eternity in conflict resolution. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I said, that's my controversial take on glorification.
Honestly,
saying that you guys are going to do great.
I love that. I love that. I think I would love to have a sit down conversation
Yeah.
where there's no like stakes anymore, you know, like no one has to accuse anyone that they're no longer a Christian, for
Yeah.
instance.
Right? Because I don't like the idea of us just getting to eternity and just everything being okay.
No.
As if it never happened. Like there's no justice or restoration or anything with that. Like
Yeah.
I still think that we're going to have to wrestle with some of the I really screwed that up kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah. One of my friends, he.
I'm going to just let you guys continue. I don't know how I'll edit this, but there you go.
Yeah.
My last thing I'll
knows?
say is that my argument for why this in Revelation is where it talks about the leaves of the tree of life will be used for the healing of the nations. And if we're already in the kingdom, why is there need healing?
That's good.
Amen, brother.
I think one of my friends brought we were talking about glorification as people are wont to do late at night. Christians are wont to do. But he shared with me that his perspective is that just like in our current time, things just sort of naturally fall apart, naturally break down. There will come a point, it won't be like this big dramatic cataclysmic thing, or it might not be, but there will come a point where things will just start to fall together again.
Yeah.
And then slowly everything will, like all the evil that we've committed against the environment, all the pollution, all the sin that we've committed against others, it'll slowly resolve and be like, and we'll get back to a good place again. But it'll be slow, you know, it'll be a slow process. And I really like that. I don't know if I can like pull verses and support this idea, but I like that idea. I think it's good. It's not going to be just like magically all of a sudden everything is good again, but there might be a process where things will get good again. I like that.
And that fits more of God understanding us as creation, because especially for those of us who are a little neurodiverse, can you imagine if you just like picked us up and dropped us back into an entirely even in our glorified, perfected state with our new bodies and whatever, like that just seems cruel.
Yeah. Yeah. Even with like a glorified neurodivergence, like that would seem
like,
really.
I'd still like to kind of ease into it, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Oh, glorified neurodivergence. I like that. Okay. That's going to be, let's chase that rabbit trail for just a second.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've talked about this idea of like interacting with the environment and what things are going to look like and kind of how we might spend our time. What do you think when we talk about glorified bodies, like looking at Jesus again as the example and like what he looks like post-resurrection? You've got these glimpses of things like at the transfiguration with Moses and Elijah, and like looking at these sorts of things. Have you done much speculation and thinking about what that's going to look like for us just as humanity in general, but specifically for queer people? Like,
yeah,
I know that you've done a little bit of thinking and work on that. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think, wow, this brings up so many different things we could talk about, and all of them are super speculative, and they could offend just about everybody.
We should just talk about all of them so that everyone's equally offended all at the same time. Yeah.
Well, over many years, I've come to the conclusion that looking at my sexuality solely through the lens of a kind of disability fails to capture the full extent of it.
Yeah.
But also the way that people, the kind of quote unquote disability lens that people use often doesn't really actually do justice to people who are disabled.
Right.
So it's tricky, but I think that there's something about my queerness that is cultural, that happened because of certain circumstances in my life, and I think those circumstances are always going to be a part of my past, and so that part of my queerness is not going to get erased in glory. But I think there's also something really deep and a core experience of my sexuality, my being gay, that is not actually related to same-sex sexual desire, which I think will fade
Yeah.
away. So I think Wes Hill, in his book Washed and Waiting, there was this section where he said he and Henri Nouwen and Gerard Manley Hopkins will get to the resurrection and they'll marvel that they're not gay anymore. But then years later, he came back to that in a blog post on spiritual friendship, and that post has been really important to me. And he
Yeah.
said, I just don't know if that's the right way to say that anymore. And so I think I will be gay in the resurrection. It'll like the sin will be removed, but I don't think that my experience right now is reducible to sin or
Right.
brokenness. And I think it's similar. I'm sort of speaking out of my depth here. This is only by analogy. So, disabled folks, y'all should come in and we should have a conversation about this. But
Yes.
speculating, I think it's similar with disability. Like disability is not just a kind of brokenness. There's a kind of goodness in it too. And so I don't think that it's quite right to say that disabled folks whose lives are so beautiful, in part because of their disability, that they're quote unquote not gonna be disabled anymore. Like some
Right.
of that is true, I guess, but like, I mean, if you take away my being gay, who am I? Like that sounds like a different person.
Right.
So, so there's part of me that's really wrapped up with that.
Exactly.
I think it's similar with all sorts of other things. But of course, disabled folks, please please reach out to me. Let's talk about it. But I'm sort of speaking
Yeah.
out of my depth there. But
Yeah. I mean, I've had friends that, specifically with hearing impairments, that have kind of speculated about that, and it's like it's such a part of who they are, that if you think, when people talk about the idea of everyone being perfected in our glorified state, that we're going to have these new glorified bodies and they're going to work just fine. Everything is going to be exactly the way it was supposed to be before the fall. And they can't even fathom what that is like,
yeah,
because they're like, I would inherently be a different person. So like,
mm,
what does that look like? How does that, and that's an interesting thing to speculate on, of, when sin and the effects of sin are
hmm,
removed, I think that we're going to be really surprised at what remains. Like, we
yeah,
think that everything, we're all going to be equal as far as abilities, and absolutely no differences in body. That sounds horrifically, again, boring. Like,
yeah,
everybody's just going to be all the same. And that seems to take away part of our humanity, because so much of what it means to be human is to display the diversity
hmm,
of God.
yeah,
And if we're just all the same, it doesn't really seem like we're going to have the opportunity to do that.
yeah.
But I heard somebody, and I've been racking my brain while you were talking, trying to think of where the conversation was taking place, and I cannot remember. But some people talking about the idea of, in end times, specifically looking at like sexuality and things like, oh, it was on here, it was one of our episodes, that's it. Like,
Oh,
I was
it
like,
was
where?
us.
Yeah, it was us that was having this conversation. That it's gonna be like, without the desire, like the sexual desire of same-sex attraction, at its root, there's not anything wrong with desiring to be in relationship with people of the same sex. And so you have
Exactly.
this spectrum of relationship desires, that there are some people that they just, I know lots of girls that most of their friends are guys, and I know guys that most of their friends are girls, and I know non-binary people that have kind of an evenly divided friend. Like, that's just, people are attracted to different kinds of
Hmm.
people. and it doesn't necessarily have much to do with gender or sexual attraction, but that we will be able to see how that preference for being with people of the same sex or of the opposite sex, or looking at gender diversity, how that is going to play in eternity when it's not affected by sin and
Yeah.
temptation. That, used to, we spent a whole lot of time just culturally as humanity, men spent a whole lot of time with biological men, and
Hmm.
women spent a whole lot of time with biological women. And so there was a lot of, especially for those of us that had more same sex attraction, that we needed to be with people of the same sex for intimacy and understanding. That happened naturally because so much of human culture was divided by
Hmm.
sex. But it's really only been in like the last 200 years that humanity's kind of all been thrown in together. And so for those who needed that, we've kind of come up short.
Hmm.
And like just that thinking of, imagine what it's going to be like for people who naturally have a desire to be known and to know people of the same sex, and it not be tainted with that relational temptation of sex is the highest form of love,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
what, I mean, humanity has been tempted with for since the beginning, it feels like sometimes.
Hmm.
But to be able to bypass that and to transcend that into a spiritual and relational intimacy, for us to be able to see how good same-sex relationships can be when they aren't tainted and tempted by sin. And the same for heterosexual
For
relationships.
sure.
I mean, when Jesus talks about the fact that in eternity we're not going to be given in marriage, if that idea of sexual desire is changed or altered or tamed or doesn't even exist because there's no need to procreate in
Hmm.
eternity,
Hmm.
like how is that going to affect the relationship between people just in general? I mean, not
Yeah.
even having to look necessarily just at queerness, but especially people who are like hypersexualized straight people, like the only way they know how to relate to the opposite sex is in a sexual relationship. Like, how much is eternity going to confuse them when they realize that sex has nothing to do with, I mean, like, there's still like discipleship and learning about ourselves that's going to have to
Yes.
take place, you
Yeah.
know?
That's so exciting. That's so exciting.
Yeah,
I
I mean, we're going to have to learn how to relate to people all over again.
Yeah. I also, as you were talking, I also was thinking how, like, in a world where there is death,
Yeah.
we have limited time. And so we necessarily have to prioritize certain relationships over other relationships.
Right.
But in the resurrection, that there will be no limit. Like, I can always, like, even if I don't see you for like 300 years or whatever the equivalent is in
Right.
eternity, but like, I will never have to regret that I haven't seen you. I can just see you. Like,
Yeah.
it's there's so much, like, really practical, there's so many really practical things that we're gonna to realize are just totally transcended,
Yeah.
and it's just gonna be so good.
Yeah. Well, and that's where it like gets into the fun stuff of like looking at Jesus's post-resurrection body, that he just comes and goes as he darn well pleases, you
Hmm.
know?
Hmm.
Like space and time don't seem to impact him anymore. And so like that's one question I've had of just like wondering about things like that. Like Jesus is clearly in his glorified body, like transcending space and time.
Yeah, he is.
But if then none of us are held by space and time because we are in eternity, there is a new heaven and a new earth. Like, what does that look like? Like, can I have breakfast in Chattanooga with my family and then go like chill in Afghanistan for dinner? And it's just like
Maybe.
there, right? I mean, like there are no time zones. There's no like, yeah, it just fascinates me to think about how that's going to work. Like if we are created inside of time, but we're going to be outside of time, like time ends and we're in eternity, but the earth was specifically created within time because day and night, and like that's the kind of stuff that like
Yeah.
breaks my brain when I can't sleep at night. That's the kind of stuff that I think about. Like
Yeah.
how are we going to be on earth but there's no time, but the like is the earth going to keep spinning, or what does that look? That's the kind of stuff that throws me off.
I think we're all just trying to latch on to images that emphasize how good eternity is going to be, but
Yeah.
they're all gonna fall short of the reality. Like there's just no way to conceptualize it.
Yeah.
I mean, even I've been really interested lately in the sort of apophatic approach to theology. The idea
Yeah.
that it's always more accurate to say what God is not than what God is, because
Yes.
every time you say something that God is, it's necessarily going to fall short.
Yeah.
So it leads you to say really like on their face really ridiculous things like God is not a being.
Right.
God doesn't exist. And the idea is like God doesn't exist in any way that we can understand existence.
Right.
God isn't a being. He is being. He's so far beyond any of our conceptions. And I think that's part of that applies to the resurrection too. Like the moment you say
Yeah.
something about the resurrection, it's like, well, I don't know if that's going to actually quite get it, because we're going to be journeying into God forever. I
Right.
mean, that's what eternity is. We're going to just be learning more and more about God. We're going to experience more and more of the divine
Yeah.
forever. And even the word forever, like the word forever falls short. What does forever
Yeah.
mean? It's not like it's going to be like this year after year sort of thing. It's going to be even better than time, like even more, even greater. I didn't even know how to explain it, but
Yeah. That's one of the things I love about reading John's words in scripture, that I mean, he knew Jesus better than probably anybody besides his mom. And he is this beloved disciple. You read his work and like he gets it. And at the end of his gospel, he's like, Jesus did so many other things, like there's just not even enough ink or paper in the world for me to explain it. And then you read Revelation, and regardless of your views on eschatology, like you can tell dude is struggling to explain what he's
yeah,
seeing. Like,
yeah,
whether he is talking about the Roman Empire at the time, or he's talking about like Iran and Russia and an antichrist in the middle of a 3.5 year tribulation. However you want to look at it, he is struggling to explain what he's seeing.
yeah,
And the fact that he so gets Jesus and still has such a hard time talking about the glory and the transcendence of what he sees in heaven and what he sees taking place as Jesus comes back to reign in victory, that if the person who was a fallen human that knew Jesus best on a day-to-day kind of basis had such a hard time explaining what he saw, and he had probably the deepest context of most people to be able to explain it, it's like the rest of us just don't even have a shot. Like we can just like we can read his stuff and be like, yeah, sure, but we have no idea. Like when Paul talks about the we can't even imagine, I mean, it's
yeah,
more than we could ask or imagine. Like we literally don't even have the tools available to ask the questions.
yeah,
Like we don't even know what questions to ask. And used to, that really freaked me out because I like knowledge and I like to know and I like to understand what's coming. But the more that I have learned to love and to trust God as Father and Creator and lover of my soul,
Mm,
the more that excites me because I trust the fact that it's just going to be good, and it's going to be more good than I can imagine it's going to be. And it's more of like anticipation as opposed to anxiety, you know?
yeah, yeah. Something that's coming to mind as we're talking about how language fails is I'm in the middle of auditing a class right now just for funsies on
I love that.
mystical commentary on the Song of Songs. Um,
Oh.
it's oh my
Oh,
gosh.
is this where the Eros post on Substack
Yes.
came
Oh
from?
yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good,
Yes.
good.
It's so good.
Yay!
Um, but a part of the tradition of commentary on the Song of Songs is this idea that the books ascribed to Solomon follow a pattern that builds.
Yeah.
So the first is either Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, and the second is either Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, but the third is Song of Songs. And the idea is that the spiritual life is moving from, say, like Origin says, moving from Proverbs, which is like moral instruction, to Ecclesiastes, which is being purged of like worldly attachments. And finally, what you get to is union with God. And
Yeah.
the only language that does any kind of justice to what union with God looks like is erotic love. Like
Yeah.
that's the purpose of erotic language, is because that's what our union with God is going to be like. And so there's this idea, and I'm kind of convinced of it actually. So I grew up thinking Song of Songs was like Jewish love poetry, and on its face, it was written for it was written for a human couple. It was written about
Yeah.
a human couple. But I'm sort of starting to be convinced that it's actually written to be allegory.
Yeah.
It's written for the purpose of describing our relationship with God. And so all this marital imagery, even even sex and marriage itself, is really telling about what the resurrected life, what glory is going to be like. Um, yeah, I don't. That just really excites me. That really gets me going. And maybe it's because my life has been sort of shaped by a focused attention on the erotic, either because I was really
Right.
scared of it or like really forced into it, or but like the language just really clicks for me. I think that that language is maybe the best shot we have at describing what eternity is going to be like. We're going to be in love with God forever, in ecstasy
Yeah.
with God
Yeah.
forever.
Yeah. And when you think about the fact, like, people that, I'm gonna kind of tread lightly with that. Hold on, let me think about that. Like, those who have no relationship with God, like I was gonna say, it's easy enough for people who do have a relationship with God for sex to become an idol. But when you have no relationship or understanding of God, and you are only working with sex, like it's not a both and, it's an either or for you at that point, that a sexual relationship and that sort of union is most likely the closest you are going to come to understanding a union with God.
Hmm.
And I mean, I don't think it's something that people are really going to argue. C.S. Lewis talks about this a lot, just how grand and fantastic sex is. Nobody's ever going to be like, I mean, on the grand scale of human experiences, I'd place it at like a 3 out of 5. I mean, like, it seems to be like across human history, a generally accepted universal understanding that sex is the mind blowing pleasure experience of human existence.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean,
Sure. Fine.
we'll go with it. And like when you read like Lewis's statement about uh like handing over this idea of sex and love, and the fact that even how high we set it as like the ultimate fully spiritual, relational, physical experience of humanity. And yet he still describes it as playing in a mud puddle compared to the love of Christ.
Yeah.
Like, that's the highest experience you can have as a human, and it is playing in mud compared to being in relationship with Christ. And if people could really grasp the depth and ridiculousness of that statement, like, people struggle, especially with those of us that have made a commitment to celibacy, because they cannot comprehend something being better than sex. They think that we are idiots. But like, when you can just get that glimpse of the fact that it's just a taste
Yeah.
of what you've got, if you will just
Yeah.
trust the creator who made you, who created you intentionally to have those thoughts and feelings and sensations and all of that.
Yeah.
And he says, this is just a whisper and a shadow of what it's like to be in intimate relationship with me. If we could just trust that,
Yeah.
I mean, how different the world would be now before we ever even get to the glorification part,
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. Even if I'm not totally convinced that sex is the highest
Yeah, me
human
neither. But,
intimacy.
that tends to be the
But
popular theory, right?
Yeah, but even if, like, sexual intimacy, not everyone has access to,
Exactly.
and not everyone can or even should pursue. But
Right.
the kind of intimacy to which sexual intimacy points, our intimacy with God, is open to all.
Exactly.
And in some sense, this might be slightly spicy, but I think that people who are celibate, who have renounced the world in maybe some important ways, might be able to grasp, might be freed up to grasp that divine human intimacy in a deeper way than those who are perhaps distracted. This is what the Apostle Paul says. The married man
Yeah.
is anxious about the affairs of the world, but the unmarried man is anxious about the affairs of God. So,
Right.
yeah, I think that really excites me about celibacy. Yeah.
Sounds a little possibly inspired by some fantastic saint named Dorothy.
Oh, yeah,
Seems a little
yes.
similar to some things that perhaps that she would have said.
Oh gosh, did you
I
read
know.
that article? You read that
Oh, it
article.
was
It was
fantastic.
so good. This
Yes,
America Magazine article. It was so good.
we
We
will
loved
include it
it.
in the show notes because it was transformative. I
It's
told some
so
people,
good.
I was like, it's a Catholic article about Dorothy Day, and I had such a phenomenal conversation with some straight reformed friends about it that they were like, I'm going to have to sit with this and think about it. That makes so much sense. And this gives me so much language to things that I've felt and desired and understood, but never felt like I was allowed to express because of my American puritanical beliefs on sex and relationships and whatever. And it is absolutely phenomenal. So, yeah, we got to make sure that that's included in the notes so that
It's
people can go read
so
it and their worlds
killer.
can be rocked.
Yes.
Um, but not like suppressing sexuality. Like, the kind of summing up is this idea that Dorothy did not suppress sexuality because she was single and celibate, but discussed it and embraced it and was like, this is who I am and this is what I experience, and shared how she felt about interacting with relationships past and present and whatever it was that happened, whether in dreams or whatever, and saying, this is how God created me to be, and it is pointing to and establishing a greater thing. And she leaned into her sexuality as a single celibate woman as opposed to denying it or suppressing it. And that was just revolutionary
Yeah.
to those of us non-Catholics reading it, because we've just been told act as much as you can as if you don't desire sex. Pretend to be asexual. If you can't make your same-sex attraction go away, at least be asexual. Like that's somehow better. And like hers is the exact opposite. She was like, I'm going to lean into the fact that God created me this way and I enjoy it, and it's pointing me to something even better. And it
Yeah.
was beautiful.
It's for me, it sort of connects with what I was saying earlier about Gregory of Nyssa and how like eternity is going to be entering deeper and deeper into God, which means that for eternity we will be longing for more and more of God. And
Yeah.
so that changes how we actually approach our longings now, because it's not like in the resurrection we're going to not desire anything anymore. We're going to
Right.
be we're going to be stoic and stationary, and we're not going to want anything. But
Yeah.
but in the resurrection we're going to always be wanting more. We're never going to be finally satisfied. So in the here and now, when I'm dealing with longings and yearnings, I don't have to fall into the trap of thinking that there will be some way to finally satisfy these desires,
Yeah.
because there won't be. What I can do is I can follow these desires all the way back to their source, and their source is God. And I can follow them like tributaries up a river, and eventually, like through those desires, not despite those desires, but in
Right.
some sense through them, I can long for God, and God will never disappoint.
Yeah.
Other things will disappoint, but God will never disappoint.
Exactly. Oh, like what are the basic kind of counseling things you might hear? It almost feels kind of cliche at this point because I've heard it so much, but like illegitimate desire has a legitimate root. Like there is, when you are talking about a sinful desire, there is a root in it somewhere of something that is real and something that is good, because sin can only twist God's creation. Like it's not new and creative in and of itself.
Yeah.
And so when, instead of ignoring or suppressing or denying those desires, if you can take the time to figure out what it is that you really, really are looking for, that it's always going to point you back to Christ and this relationship and this understanding. And even when it is intimacy, when you have a longing for intimacy with a human being, it is still an intimacy and a longing for what we are going to have in Christ, because
Yeah.
we are never going to be satisfied on this earth with anything that is only going to be fulfilled in eternity. And even then, our longing is glorified in a way that it's not satisfied, but it is always going to find an outlet. We are
Yeah.
always going to be learning. We are always going to be growing. We are always going to be more and more
Yeah.
in an understanding. Like sanctification is completed, we are glorified, but we don't quit learning. Like we don't
Yeah.
just immediately know everything there is to know about an infinite God, you know? And
Yeah.
getting that and understanding what that is going to look like, especially from a queer perspective. Like I think this is part of the speculation that I don't know how many other people would wonder about something like this, but this is something I think about. Looking at how much conflict there tends to be in the church with questions about just queerness in general. How much of that is going to not be an issue, obviously, since we're going to be glorified and sin is no longer a question. But how is that going to be dealt with and addressed, and what's that going to look like? You know, like when you talk to very conservative Christians, it goes back to the disability question, as if everything is going to be erased and we're all going to be very uniform. Like I've had so much so of very conservative white people specifically saying that they think everybody is pretty much going to look the same in our glorified bodies, because Adam and Eve, they were the only two people. We'll just kind of all go back to looking the same because clearly they must have looked the same, as if it's going to erase part of our humanity in the diversity of,
Yeah.
as if that diversity was not actually part of God's plan. Like the diversity of humanity as a result of the fall, which is a horrible
That's bad.
thing to think about, right?
Bad.
So like, exactly. So like what that is going to look like for LGBTQ people specifically is is that going to be a perfected, glorified acceptance of a huge, broad range of expression and of appearance, and just that, like the realization I've had of the last couple of years that in eternity, I'm not necessarily the one that's going to change. It's going to be the hearts of those who judge us. But like, it's okay to think about and to speculate about those things, and for all of us to go, girl, I don't even know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Like, you and your insomnia need to just sit on that for a little while longer, you know?
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to think about that one for a little while. I'll keep thinking. We'll see what we come up with.
Yeah, we'll see what we come up with. Look out for our systematic theology coming out. No, just kidding. Just kidding.
Life on Side B, Theology Part 1. It'll be great.
Ooh, that'd be
Find
weird.
some people to work with
Weird
that.
and wild.
I know. I kind of love it. Any other thoughts from you, Grant, about glorification and eternity?
About glorification and eternity. I mean, I think we got a lot of them.
Yeah.
That was, I was really nervous at the beginning of this, but I think we got some interesting stuff out there. We really gloried in it. That's what it is. We're like, this gets us excited, and it should get us excited.
Yeah, I think that's really the point of it, is anticipating what eternity is going to look like.
Yeah.
And I love that idea. Well, thanks for having this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for guiding this.
Hopefully we've stirred some thoughts and gotten some people thinking. And
yeah, please send your hate mail to...
That's right.
I mean, you can
I'm easy
direct
to find
message me on
online.
Twitter.
That's right. I'm easy to find online. Send it to me. It's no problem.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks so much, Bekah.
Thank you.